All right, everybody, and welcome to another episode of This Week in Hearing. Today, we are going to have a CES theme discussion, and I'm joined by two attendees of the show. So with me today is Kevin Liebe. Kevin is a practicing audiologist and the president of Hearing Health Technology Matters. Also one of the key figures here with This Week in Hearing. And I'm also joined by Andy Bellavia. Andy is the founder of AuraFuturity. So why don't we kick things off? Kevin, I know this was your first CES, so why don't you kind of share your perspective as an audiologist attending this show for the first time?
Yeah, so thanks for having me on, Dave. After what we have over 100 episodes now, I guess I'm going to sit on this side of the this side of the table.
Yeah, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah. So yeah, it was. I've wanted to go to CES for a number of years, and I think we've been kind of seeing a trend in the hearing space, kind of since hearables and that whole concept kind of became pretty popular here, like 2015, 2016. So it's been something I've been wanting to do. Obviously, the pandemic kind of had some other ideas here the last few years. So this year I was fortunate enough to be able to attend. I'd say the biggest thing, just in general, I was just completely blown away by the scale of the meeting. I've been to some large conferences before, but this is, 10, 15, 20 times bigger than any audiology conference I've ever been to. It is just a massive, hard even to wrap my head around how big the event was. So in that context, trying to find all of the hearing exhibits and things like that was kind of challenging, actually, but it kind of really eye-opening, and kind of just seeing where hearing technology kind of is falling into the broader kind of technology discussion and exhibit. But it was yeah, I feel like I barely scratched the surface after being there for like 3 days. So it was but it was really interesting to check out some of the exhibits and kind of to see where hearing is falling in the trends of accessibility and just technology in general.
Awesome. Cool. Well, we'll get into a lot of what you guys saw, but before that, I'll kick it over to Andy. I know this is not the first time you've been to CES, so quick take on CES 2023 from you.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, it was good to be back. January 2020 was my last one. I didn't go last year, the one that was much reduced in size. And I probably had a grin on my face the whole time to, finally after 3 years be immersed in that environment. And I had learned over time what you have to do is you have to do your homework and be very focused on what you're doing because it's impossible to cover all of it. So you have to know in advance what you want to go see and then you go attack it. The big difference between this one and 3 years ago was that more people are moving into suites and having private meetings. There's still a lot of exhibit space. In the innovation area, Eureka Park and the Venetian was really interesting, and a few people were out with public stands like Nuheara, for example, and Eargo also, but a lot of the real work was going on in suites this year, more so than I recall 3 years ago. And so I spent a lot of time in suites, but that means that general people are not wandering into the suites and seeing these things, but it's meetings that are scheduled in advance. That was the big difference between now and in the past, I think.
Okay, interesting. So in terms of what you saw, what really stood out to you? We'll start with you, Andy.
Well, at high level, I saw two things that were really interesting. One was a general focus on healthy aging and accessibility. Even in the healthy aging department, CTA, the Consumer Technology Association, who puts on CES, they made a partnership with BBC Storyworks, and they kicked off a whole series on how technology can support healthy aging. And there was a lot of emphasis there at the show itself. Even, for example, AARP had a huge booth with a shared space for a lot of people innovating in aging tech. And they also had their own kind of stage and presentation area where they were hosting different talks throughout CES. And then the other one is, although there weren't a lot of people with finished hearing or hearing related products there were a lot of people doing allied products related to hearing and communication. And there was a lot of people with technology under the hood, for example, next generation chips, a lot of people working
Mhm.
on speech and noise enhancement that will find itself into devices and the like.
Yeah, I want to definitely circle back on both those because there's, I think, a lot to discuss with both of those big observations. But Kevin, what about you? What did you what stood out in your mind?
Yeah, but yeah, just to piggyback on what Andy's saying, really, I was a little bit, having seen a lot of the press coverage the last several years with CES and the number of hearing specific related companies, there really was, I think, just New Hera and Eargo were really the only hearing aid companies that were actually exhibiting in the hall, and both had a pretty decent sized presence there. But to Andy's point, there was a lot of kind of complementary technology on display. A lot of companies seeming to get into the software space related to hearing enhancement, improving hearing and noise. And so those kind of things I did see. There were some other interesting technologies like some of the captioning companies out there, also in the accessibility realm related to hearing. The company called or there's a product called Badger made by, I think the company's name Satellite Display, I believe is the company's name. And really, they've been around for a little bit, but I think they're just kind of starting to get off the ground here with making it more widely available. But basically it's a very thin little card size device that people could wear, like healthcare provider could wear in a badge, and it would just caption in real time. Really, really neat product. A lot of application for the population that we're, as an audiologist, that we're serving. But some other just kind of interesting ear related technologies. There's a company that's working on vagal nerve stimulation through an earbud. And there was a French company that makes this headset, that little headphones that use air conduction, that looks like a bone conduction headphones, but actually uses air conduction instead. And so there's some interesting things like that. But yeah, just in general, there was kind of that broader idea of the healthy aging and accessibility, and yeah, just kind of interesting seeing some of the peripherally related products to even beyond just hearing aids.
Yeah, I think the healthy and aging thing is something that I sort of even gathered just being home and just seeing some of the press that came out of it. And I think it's really interesting that obviously that plays well into the hearing health space, knowing that it's skews, older due to the age-related hearing loss. But I just think that this whole idea of building, we know we have an aging population, and in many ways they're the least digitally native demographic within our population. So there's like a really, I think, exciting market that's building around helping to usher in older adults into technology, from smart home on down the line with all kinds of different consumer tech. I just find this to be something where, what kind of, like, for you guys, when you were looking at some of the aging tech type things, what was going through your minds in terms of how you could see this relating to hearing health in any way, shape, or form?
Well, I think the most important thing about the conversation around age tech is that it's actually taking place. In other words, that we can have a natural, stigma-free conversation about aging and all of the things one can do to live the best life possible as they get older. Okay, this kind of conversation is not too long ago would be completely taboo, and now it's not. And so that affects the larger ecosystem of aging people, but it also affects hearing and how people look at hearing as a natural part of the aging process. And just in some small way starts to dial back the stigma a little bit and enable us to have conversations about aging without all of that, ill feelings and stigma and depression that goes around having to acknowledge that you're aging and have different needs as you grow older.
Yeah, I think, like, I'm going, thinking back, Andy, to some of the different voice technology stuff that we've covered before, and just like watching that space evolve, looking at like voice assistants like Alexa and Google Assistant and stuff like that. And what's really interesting is that, when Alexa kind of came to market, I think Amazon wasn't totally sure who their target demographic was because it was so widely applicable. And, a lot of the adoption usage indicates that it's actually kind of a barbell. So you have, the youngest generation, usually kids that maybe they don't have access to like screens. And so they have a voice assistant in their home through a smart speaker. And so they're engaging with it all the time. But the other big demographic was older adults. And I think it kind of, again, speaks to the fact that like in many ways, they've sort of been sidelined by the recent epochs of technology, so like when the PC came around, it wasn't like there was a ton of use cases for them. And so they just sort of dismissed it. And then the phone came around, and the phone isn't like the best use case or the best modality for somebody that might have, dexterity issues or low vision, something like that. So it sort of makes sense that something like that would be appealing, like a voice assistant would be appealing to older demographics. And the reason I mention all this is what's interesting is if you've actually watched the product that, the different kinds of products that Amazon's been introducing for Alexa, they've gradually become more and more skewed toward older adults. And so now they have, like these smart displays that are specifically designed for assisted living communities and stuff like that, that are operating like a concierge service that can, interface with other intercoms within the system or the front desk or something like that. And so I say all this just to point out that like, it's interesting that these general technologies have sort of already began to, some of them are migrating toward appealing to older adults, sort of given the fact that they're maybe not as savvy with the current paradigms that generations like mine are super conditioned and savvy with. So they're more ripe for some of these other technologies that maybe the younger generations are dismissive of because they're totally happy with the way in which they're interfacing with technology today.
Well, and I know just as a clinician, and I mean, just you look at relatives and things like that, but just as a clinician, I mean, the last, I don't know, 5-6 years, the trend, I mean, Bluetooth, connectivity and hearing aids is ubiquitous now. You would be surprised, maybe not surprised, how many 90-plus-year-old patients that I encounter daily that have absolutely no problem using Bluetooth, connecting with an app, all that stuff, even better than some middle-aged people. I mean, it's pretty incredible just that adoption and how much more seamless that's gotten and more accepted. And maybe it's been because of COVID and like so many people can do Zoom now and all these things. But I certainly think that, having sat in with some of these roundtable discussions while I was at CES, I got to sit in some presentations and discussions with GN and some other folks that I've known and finally got to see in person, which was pretty great. But I mean, these companies like the Big Five, some of these other companies interested in the hearing space, they're looking at these technologies and looking at ways that their devices might actually be able to work in concert with that. Because you got to think like, I mean, you just think about it just out loud. You think, okay, well, if I'm wearing a device that has Bluetooth, like microphone, like gyroscope, all these things, sensors in the device, what are things that it could be syncing up with my doctor? What are things it could do that could be actually complementary to if I had an Alexa or if I had something that, worked with a healthcare provider? What if I was in a care facility and, I've got 20 people in there with hearing aids? What kind of data could that hearing aid be feeding to the medical director? I mean, there's just all kinds of really, really fascinating and really, pretty amazing kind of possibilities that we could almost do today, but at least we know what's possible in the near future, which is really kind of exciting when you think about the health implications of any kind of device that you're wearing regularly, and even some interesting outside the box kind of cases. I think it's just pretty fun to kind of think about those things.
Yeah, and like one thing I'll just add to that came to mind is like, look at the Starkey hearing aid that now has the integration with the Amazon Fire TV Cube. So this is like the first native integration where you can like actually pair your hearing aids with your smart TV or the set-top box that you're using, whatever smart top box you're using. but like that's going to be, we're going to see that cascade all the way down. So you're going to have
Right.
this probably be these kinds of integrations all over the place. And so again, it's just like, I think it's all like sort of, there's collaboration happening with big tech, with the different hearing aid manufacturers. All these things are becoming more and more feasible. And I think the end result is that, like you said, you know, on the surface, and there will be, you know, portions of the potential patient demographic that probably won't find these things appealing because they'll find them to be too cumbersome or hard to do. But there will be, I think, a portion of people that will find these to be really awesome, exciting use cases that will just increase the overall patient experience with the devices.
I mean, again, kind of getting back to what I was saying is like, just compared to 5 or 6 years ago, people's comfort with navigating a smartphone, Bluetooth, streaming calls. I mean, it's incredible how much that's really changed in a fairly short amount of time. So I don't think it's that far of a stretch that, you know, if you have something that's a fairly seamless sort of complementary technology, that it could be widely adopted if, you know, done in the right way. But I do think, you know, just the broader point of, you know, still the misconception, we all know that there's a ton of innovation in hearing aids and, you know, hearing tech, but still, I think the broader consumer population just doesn't appreciate how sophisticated these devices are and how much goes into that little tiny hearing aid. You know, I got to demo the Resound Omnias on the floor just to see how impressive the noise reduction was, and it's quite impressive. I mean, just I think, I guess my point on this is that I think hearing aids should be, I mean, CES is a great place for hearing related companies, the hearing aid companies in particular, to show off their innovations. Because I mean, the kind of things that are happening on many levels, chip level and just processing, I mean, they deserve to be there, you know, like, and people need to understand, like, it's a really incredible little device, you know, and it's part and parcel of all these other technologies that eventually and hopefully soon we'll be able to, like Auracast and some of these other emerging technologies that were present at CES. That was also something we hadn't mentioned, but there's some of these things on the horizon I think are really, really exciting.
Yeah, you make two really important points there. One is, I think we're at an inflection point right now in the hearing space, and that the generation now moving into the need for hearing care is, and I hate to generalize, but for the most part, the people moving into the need for hearing care right now are going to be much more digitally adept. They are the people who've been walking around with earphones in their ears and streaming music and all the rest. And they're both more knowledgeable, but they're also going to have a different set of needs and wants than in the past. And the second one really is it pays to appreciate the sheer size and scale of the consumer electronics industry, which you saw from your first visit to CES, right?
It's amazing, like truly,
right?
truly,
I mean,
like surprising.
Exactly. So you went down to the bottom level of the exhibit hall in the Venetian where Eureka Park is, right?
Yep.
It's maybe 10% of the size of CES, and you know, I mean, Yuha could be in that room, right?
Oh,
and so this is really important, because as the consumer electronics industry moves into the whole of aging and healthcare and well-being, including hearing, there are resources being brought to bear that will dwarf anything done in the hearing space so far. And that's actually to lift up the current state of the hearing aid world, not to denigrate it, because hearing aids are, as you say, the most amazing devices. There isn't anything with that scale of audio processing and such a small and comfortable size going on except the hearing aid industry. Okay. And that sort of thing will continue. That innovation for people who truly need a prescription hearing device is only going to get better and better, including swallowing some of these things. I spent a lot of time talking to companies working on the machine learning based speech from noise extraction, which is different than ANC. All right. The ANC is to reduce the noise acoustically, if you will, whereas the speech from noise extraction is actually analyzing the sound coming in able to extract the speech of a nearby person and reject everything else. It's a complete game changer. And that will find itself both into consumer devices for people who only need situational help, and will also find itself into hearing devices as the chip capability is able to support it, along with discrete size and long battery life. So the fusion of consumer electronics developments and hearing developments, they're going to meet in the middle, and you're going to see a suite of products. And I'll just finish that by saying this is necessary because if you think of Brett Edwards' report based on Market Track 10, and I've mentioned this before, where he identifies about 25 million people who don't even have audiometric hearing loss, but have auditory processing issues of another kind. Many of those can benefit from SNR improvement, but won't be helped by selective amplification because they don't have audiometric hearing loss. That's 25 million people right there who will benefit from these. And of course, everybody with hearing loss wants more SNR improvement out of their hearing devices. Like I can tell you, Eureka Park, after 3 years, I had every little custom trick. I'm wearing Phonak Odale Lives now, and I had tuned up the best possible speech and noise program for myself. And down in Eureka Park, it was a challenge, right? It's very, very loud, and the noise is coming from all directions. So every hearing impaired person wants more improvement than that, right? That's going to be my test. What's the best device to take down to Eureka Park next year? So these things are going to help people with no audiometric hearing loss. They can help people with severe and profound hearing loss and everything in between, and really bring a broader scope of products, both consumer and prescription, that are going to meet more people's needs where there are.
And I think that point about, kind of like the there being this upswell of innovation happening in the consumer level that will inevitably make its way to the more medical, clinical grade devices. And I just think that like this is a point that I think is just so fundamentally important to understand about like today's times, which are, you look at just the, we're talking about the scope of CES, well, what about the scope of like AirPod sales versus hearing aid sales? It's not even the same ballpark. I mean, we're talking about a handful of a few million hearing aids, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of AirPods, and that's just one brand. And so my point is that like, we've talked about this a lot, Andy, of, the peace dividends of the smartphone wars, the idea that as there's more demand for the components inside these devices, largely from the consumer arena, it actually yields a dividend that like everybody gets to reap, which is that the innovation, there's demand for the innovation to take place. And so you have like, what's happening right now, to your point, is there's all of this focus around speech and noise reduction. Well, what are going to be the innovative breakthroughs that facilitate that? It's probably going to be new processors that have the ability to, do some kind of machine learning or AI specific algorithm that's running in low power. And again, like all of these things are made feasible because there's now, because of the consumer market, there's a ton of demand for it that we in the hearing health space get to benefit from, that like, I don't know if this innovation would really exist because there isn't nearly as big of a demand for it if you're just operating in isolation there. And so I think this harmony between consumer electronics and medical, like the real bull case and the advantage for the medical side is that you get the economies of scale that the consumer market brings.
Absolutely. And that's why I brought up the scale of the consumer electronics industry. So imagine the first major audio brand who adds speech from noise extraction as part of their ANC system. Okay. You're not even talking about hearing loss. What you're saying is my adaptive ANC works well on the train, it works well on an airplane, it works well on the street, and it works well in a restaurant. And they actually start to advertise that as a feature. Okay. Now you get economy of scale. Now you're going to get audio brands that sell millions, right? Developing along these lines. And that's going to do exactly what you said. It's going to filter throughout the industry at all levels of hearing loss. Everybody benefits when the scale of the consumer electronics industry and the infrastructure around it comes properly to the hearing space.
I couldn't agree more. I think we need to applaud every major company that gets into the audio space, because I mean, you look at just last few years and just how much changes happen, like in spatial audio, and there's been a lot of investment in kind of augmented reality, but some of that stuff is bleeding into better, better function. Like there are things we're learning and we're going to be able to take advantage of because you're having millions of dollars of investment in understanding how all this stuff plays out in the metaverse is actually going to help us in real life. Same thing with, yeah, to your point, Andy. I mean, like just the massive number of things in people's ears, and people are going to demand a higher quality. And if this company gets make some innovation in speech extract, absolutely, that's going to help everybody. So we should all be super excited about that. So I mean, just having Apple, be so successful with AirPods, I mean, that fundamentally changed everything. Just a company like that, like overnight, can change the industry. So I think we should all be very happy that innovations are happening in the, maybe we don't look at it as related, but in the audio space, that's going to have bleed over to hearing health. So I think we should all look forward to that.
So Andy, you're one of the more technical people I know, in terms of like, what's actually happening from an innovation standpoint, what's significant, what do we really need to be looking at? What's your sense right now based on what you saw at CES, like here in 2023, what are you sort of forecasting as like kind of the next big breakthrough, or a next big breakthrough, I should say, not the next, but just in general, like, what do you think we're on the cusp of right now that is worth keeping an eye on this year?
Yeah, I think it's the speech from noise extraction, because we're getting to the point where we can actually run our neural network in ear. And so then you can really have advanced noise extraction techniques in the ear, and that's going to just take the level of SNR improvement up to a whole new level. That's definitely coming. It's only a matter of when and who implements a first-class solution first. You may see some incremental benefits beforehand, but all of a sudden speech and noise is going to improve by greater leaps and bounds. Right now, people are fighting over a dB or two, trying to extract every last with classical acoustic techniques. And now you're going to go to a whole new level. And that, for both consumer devices and then in prescription devices, is really going to be a game changer in improving the hardest part of hearing loss at all levels.
What's changed? I mean, like what breakthroughs have happened recently that are really enabling this? Is it primarily the chip architectures that are being deployed, or what is it that we're now that's making this feasible?
It's both chips and software. Even the mass market chips processing power is increasing to the point where people can start running solutions on them. And there are next generation chips being developed, right, that take it up another notch. And it's also the algorithms, being able to create efficient algorithms that will run on a smaller space. I mean, you can see it. So for example, meeting platforms like Zoom do noise extraction in the cloud. Then you have people doing it, in the what's the name of the hearing aid company? Whisper, who's doing it in the brain, right? They've got a low latency communication with the brain, and they're running it noise extraction in the brain. And soon you're going to have it in ear because of both the chip technology and the software development to run it in a smaller space.
Okay, so as we kind of come to the close here, closing thoughts about this year's show. Maybe Kevin, you want to share just sort of like the perspective of an audiologist and your takeaway from that standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of wrapping up with bringing everything together here is that I think, instead of being like concerned that hearing is getting more into the consumer side, we really should be embracing that, because that's just going to bring in more innovation. And I think, just like if you've ever gone to a conference, a lot of the great things happen because you have a good conversation that spurs an idea. So if you're, any one of the big five, and you happen to be at CES, and then you might come across technology that all of a sudden sparks an idea of like, oh my gosh, like that could really help the people we serve. And so I just think that just recognizing that we're just a tiny part of this broader, innovative technology sort of space, within all of this innovation happening, I think we should all be excited at everything on the horizon. So that's number one. But number two, just recognizing that being a part of that's important, because I think that's just going to help, the space innovate more to help more people. As all these technologies are getting better, I think it's just exciting. I think it's just, we should be just pretty excited about, what the future holds, just based on the small amount that I saw and the conversations that I had. I think, there's just so much exciting stuff that's going to be coming down the pipe soon.
For sure. Andy, closing thoughts?
Yeah, I'm gonna riff on Kevin's opening description of CES for a first timer and leave everyone with the takeaway that if you haven't been there before and you're considering going, decide what you want to focus on in advance, do your homework, book meetings in the suites where necessary, and have a focused plan, because it's really easy to just get lost and wander around, going, oh, that looks terrific, and oh, that's interesting. Whereas if you have a focus, then you're going to learn the most about those things that matter the most to you. It's the kind of show that demands that. It's like for anybody who's gone to the Louvre, try doing the Louvre in one day. Okay. It's totally impossible. You have to pick your shots. And I definitely recommend you do that with CES if you go for the first time.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, guys. It's nice to get a firsthand account of this year's CES. I'm sure we'll have to tune in again next year for a 2024 recap. But thanks for everybody who tuned in here to the end, and we will chat with you next time. Cheers.